I let a stranger into my dreams. Now he won't let me go. The first time I saw him, I didn't think much of it. He was just a man in a coffee shop, sitting at a corner table with a book in his hands. His dark hair fell into his eyes, and his lips were curved into a faint smile, as if he were privy to some private joke. I might not have noticed him at all if he hadn't looked up just as I walked in, his gaze locking onto mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. I looked away quickly, my cheeks burning, and ordered my usual latte. But even as I waited for my drink, I could feel his eyes on me, a weight that pressed against my skin like a hand. When I glanced back, he was still watching me, his smile widening just enough to make my stomach twist. I told myself it was nothing. Just a stranger, just a look. But as I left the coffee shop, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, like the air itself had grown heavier, more charged. That night I dreamed of him. It was a strange dream, fragmented and surreal. He was standing at the edge of a forest, his silhouette dark against the pale moonlight. He didn't speak, but I could feel his presence, a pull that drew me closer even as my instincts screamed at me to run. When I woke, my heart was pounding, and the sheets were tangled around my legs like chains. I told myself it was just a dream, the kind of thing that happens when you're stressed or overtired. But the image of him stayed with me, lingering in the corners of my mind like a shadow I couldn't quite shake. A few days later I saw him again. This time he was at the park, sitting on a bench beneath a tree. He looked up as I walked by, and again that smile, slow, knowing, as if he'd been waiting for me. I hesitated, my feet slowing of their own accord, and for a moment I thought about stopping, about saying something. But then my phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking the spell, and I hurried on my way. That night, the dream returned. This time he was closer, close enough that I could see the details of his face, the sharp angles of his jaw, the faint stubble along his chin, the way his eyes seemed to glow in the dark. He reached out a hand, and though I knew I should pull away, I didn't. I let him touch me, his fingers brushing against my cheek, and the moment his skin met mine, I woke up, gasping for air. The dreams became more frequent after that, more vivid. I started seeing him during the day too, glimpses of him in the crowd, his face turning toward me before disappearing into the throng. At first I told myself it was my imagination, that I was just seeing what I wanted to see. But the more it happened, the harder it became to convince myself that it wasn't real. And then one day he spoke to me. I was at the grocery store, reaching for a box of cereal, when I felt that familiar weight of his gaze. I turned, and there he was, standing at the end of the aisle, his hands in his pockets and that same smile on his lips. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice low and smooth like velvet. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "I don't even know you," I replied, my voice trembling. He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving mine. "You will," he said, and then he was gone, disappearing around the corner before I could say another word. That night, I lay in bed beside my husband, James, staring at the ceiling. He was asleep, his breathing slow and steady, but I couldn't relax. My mind was racing, my skin still tingling from the memory of that man's voice, his touch, his presence. I didn't know who he was or what he wanted, but I knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let me go. The dreams didn't stop. If anything, they grew more vivid, more real. Every night, I found myself back in that forest, the trees towering above me like silent sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky. And every night he was there waiting for me. At first, he kept his distance, watching me from the shadows with those glowing eyes. But as the nights passed, he grew bolder. He would step closer, his presence pressing against me like a weight, until I could feel the heat of his breath on my skin. He never touched me, not at first, but I could feel the promise of it, the anticipation like a storm gathering on the horizon. I started to dread sleep, to fear the moment when I would close my eyes and find myself back in that forest. But no matter how hard I tried to stay awake, exhaustion always won, pulling me under and into his world. During the day, I tried to pretend everything was normal. I went to work, I cooked dinner, I smiled at James and laughed at his jokes. But it was getting harder to keep up the act. I was tired, so tired, and the lack of sleep was starting to take its toll. I found myself zoning out in the middle of conversations, forgetting things I had just been told, jumping at the slightest noise. James noticed, of course. He always noticed. "Are you okay?" he asked one night as we lay in bed. His voice soft with concern. "I'm fine," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just tired." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. He never did. And part of me wished he would. Wished he would see through the lies and demand the truth. But another part of me was relieved. I didn't know how to explain what was happening to me. How to put into words the fear and the longing that had taken root in my chest. And then one night everything changed. I was in the forest again, the moonlight filtering through the trees and casting everything in shades of silver and black. He was there as always, but this time he didn't keep his distance. This time he stepped out of the shadows and into the light. His eyes burning with an intensity that made my breath catch. "You can't keep running from me," he said. His voice low and smooth like velvet. "You belong to me now." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, that I didn't belong to anyone. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself stepping closer, drawn to him like a moth to a flame. He reached out a hand, his fingers brushing against my cheek, and the moment his skin touched mine, I felt it. A jolt of electricity that shot through me like a bolt of lightning. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once, and I knew in that moment that I was lost. When I woke up, I was alone in my bed, the sheets tangled around my legs and my heart pounding in my chest. But I could still feel the ghost of his touch on my skin, the echo of his voice in my ears. And I knew, with a certainty that made my stomach twist, that he wasn't just in my dreams anymore. He was in my head, in my heart, in my very soul. And I didn't know how to get him out. The days blurred together, each one indistinguishable from the last. I moved through them like a ghost, my body going through the motions while my mind wandered elsewhere. James tried to reach me, his concern growing with each passing day, but I couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth. How could I explain something I didn't even understand myself? The man, Daniel as I had come to think of him, was everywhere. In my dreams, in the shadows of my home, in the reflection of my mirror when I dared to look. He didn't speak often, but when he did, his voice was a low, insidious whisper that sent shivers down my spine. "You're mine," he would say, his voice echoing in the empty spaces of my mind. "You've always been mine." I tried to fight it, to push him out, but it was like trying to hold back the tide. The more I resisted, the stronger his pull became, until I could no longer tell where he ended and I began. One night, I woke to find him standing at the foot of my bed. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon outside, but I could see him clearly, his silhouette sharp against the shadows. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps, but I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I was frozen, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape. He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, until he was standing beside me. I could feel the heat of his body, the weight of his presence pressing down on me like a physical force. He reached out a hand, his fingers brushing against my cheek, and I felt that same jolt of electricity, that same terrifying pull. "You can't run from me," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You belong to me now." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, that I didn't belong to anyone. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I felt myself leaning into his touch, my body betraying me even as my mind screamed in protest. The next morning I woke up alone, the sheets tangled around my legs and my heart pounding in my chest. But I could still feel the ghost of his touch on my skin, the echo of his voice in my ears. And I knew, with a certainty that made my stomach twist, that I was losing myself to him. James was sitting on the edge of the bed when I opened my eyes. His face pale and his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and concern. "You were talking in your sleep," he said, his voice trembling. You kept saying his name. Who is Daniel? I stared at him, my mind racing. I wanted to tell him the truth, to confess everything and beg for his forgiveness. But the words stuck in my throat, heavy and suffocating. Instead, I shook my head and looked away, unable to meet his gaze. I don't know, I whispered, my voice barely above a whisper. Just a dream. But we both knew it was more than that. Now I'm standing at a crossroads, torn between two worlds. James, my husband, who has stood by me through everything, who deserves so much better than this. And Daniel, who haunts my dreams and my waking hours, a shadow I can't escape. I don't know who to choose, or if I even have the right to choose. All I know is that no matter what I do, someone will get hurt.